The truth unveiled. The certified mail arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the casual indifference of a postal worker who had no idea she was handing me the end of my world. Inside the manila envelope was a marriage certificate, not mine, but my husband's, dated 3 months after our own wedding, bearing the name of a woman I thought was safely buried in his past. My name is Catherine Mills, and I am 42 years old. Until that morning, I believed I was a happily married architect living in the tree-lined suburbs of Portland, Oregon, with a successful practice designing sustainable homes and a marriage I'd spent 12 years nurturing. The woman staring back at me from my bathroom mirror that morning looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, clutching a legal document that proved everything I thought I knew about my life was a carefully constructed lie. I remember standing in my kitchen afterward, still in my silk pajamas, the certificate spread across the granite countertop like evidence at a crime scene. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar morning song, but the sound felt foreign now, as if I'd awakened in someone else's life. David had left early for his business trip to Seattle, or so he'd told me. Now I wondered if he'd gone to see her, this other wife whose existence had somehow remained hidden from me for over a decade. Sarah Chen. I knew that name. She was the college girlfriend he'd spoken of occasionally, always with a wistful tone that I'd once found endearing rather than threatening. We were young. He used to say when her name came up in stories about his university days. Different people then. I'd never pressed for details, secure in the knowledge that I was his chosen one, his true love, his only wife. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. As an architect, I built foundations, solid, lasting structures designed to weather any storm. Yet the foundation of my own life had been nothing but sand and lies, crumbling the moment truth touched it. I called my office and told my assistant I wouldn't be in, citing a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. Then I did what any rational person in my position would do. I hired a private investigator. Marcus Webb looked exactly like Central Casting would order for a private detective: rumpled suit, tired eyes, the kind of patient demeanor that suggested he'd heard every variation of human betrayal. His office smelled of stale coffee and disappointment, but his voice was kind when I handed him the marriage certificate with shaking hands. "Mrs. Mills," he said after studying the document, "I know this is devastating, but you need to understand that we might uncover things that will hurt even more. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of the 12 years I'd spent believing in David's love, the dreams we'd shared of children that never came, the compromises I'd made to support his career while mine took second place. "I need to know the truth," I told him. "All of it." The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which I moved through my days like an actress playing a role, greeting David with the same smile when he returned from his business trips, making dinner, discussing our weekend plans, all while knowing that every word from his mouth might be another lie. I became a student of deception, watching for tells in his expressions, analyzing his phone habits, noting when he showered immediately upon coming home. The photographs Marcus showed me were worse than I'd imagined. David and Sarah at restaurants I'd never been to, walking hand in hand through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, kissing on the steps of what appeared to be their shared apartment. But it was the domestic images that cut deepest: Sarah in David's old college t-shirt, the one I'd been washing and folding for years, and David teaching a little boy to ride a bicycle in what looked like a suburban driveway. "The child?" I managed to ask. "Tyler Chen Morrison, age 8. Birth certificate lists David Morrison as the father." The room spun. David Morrison. He'd been using his middle name as his surname with her, just different enough to complicate any accidental discoveries but close enough to his real identity to avoid the complications of a completely false persona. And a son. A child he'd never mentioned, never acknowledged, never brought home to meet me. I spent that night walking through our house. My house, I realized, since the mortgage was in my name alone, seeing everything with new eyes. The guest room that David insisted we keep just in case, which now struck me as sterile and unused because he had another home where he truly lived. The absence of truly personal photos of us together, which I'd attributed to his private nature, but now understood as a practical necessity for a man living a double life. The business trips that happened with clockwork regularity, every other weekend and at least 1 week per month. In the dark hours before dawn, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I would not confront David with tears and accusations. I would not throw dishes or demand explanations. Instead, I would do what I did best: I would build something. Not a structure this time, but a carefully crafted revelation that would expose the truth in a way that left no room for his manipulation or lies. I spent the next week writing, not a letter or an email, but a detailed blog post for my professional architecture website, a platform that had garnered a modest but engaged following over the years. I wrote about foundations, about the difference between structures built on solid ground and those constructed on shifting sand. I wrote about discovering that the life you thought you were building was actually built on someone else's property, but I didn't stop at metaphors. I methodically documented everything: the marriage certificate, the photographs Marcus had provided, copies of David's credit card statements that showed a pattern of double charges, flowers ordered twice on Valentine's Day, restaurant bills for meals I'd never eaten, hotel stays during his supposed business trips to cities where his company had no clients. I wrote about the realization that I'd been funding my own betrayal, that the joint account I'd been contributing to for years had been subsidizing his other life. I detailed the discovery that our house was actually my house, that while I'd been building equity and making mortgage payments, David had been building a second life with Sarah Chen, a marriage that legally superseded ours since it was never dissolved while he'd married me. The post was titled, "When the Foundation Crumbles, a Case Study in Structural Failure." I included architectural diagrams showing how a structure collapses when its foundation is compromised, drawing parallels to the systematic deception that had undermined my marriage. It was professional, devastating, and utterly truthful, but I didn't publish it immediately. Instead, I did one more thing that would ensure maximum impact. I researched Sarah Chen. She was a pediatric nurse at Portland Children's Hospital, well regarded in her field, active in community organizations. She had social media accounts filled with pictures of her son, her work, her life, a life that clearly included David, though she was careful never to tag him or use his full name. But she followed him on Instagram, and he followed her back under his David Morrison account. I created anonymous accounts on various social media platforms and began documenting the overlap between their lives and mine. The restaurant where David had taken me for my birthday last year, the same place he'd taken Sarah the week before. The vacation photos from the beach house we'd rented, posted 3 weeks before Sarah posted nearly identical sunset shots from what was clearly the same location. The morning I was ready to publish, David left for another business trip. I watched him pack his suitcase, kiss my cheek, and promise to call that evening, all while knowing he was going home to his other family. 20 minutes after his car disappeared around the corner, I hit publish. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My professional colleagues began sharing the post, adding their own comments about trust and honesty in both business and personal relationships. Local news outlets picked up the story within hours. It had everything they loved: a successful local professional, a shocking betrayal, and enough documentation to verify every claim. But it was social media where the story truly exploded. Architecture and design blogs shared it. Women's forums dissected it, and by evening, it was trending on Twitter under #FoundationFail. Someone had taken my professional headshot and created memes about building your life on solid ground, which should have been offensive but somehow felt empowering instead. David called that evening, as promised. His voice was tight with panic. "Catherine, we need to talk. I'm coming home." "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "I don't think we do need to talk. I think everything that needed to be said has been said." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You're married to Sarah Chen. You have been for 12 years. You have a son with her named Tyler. You live in an apartment on Hawthorne Boulevard when you're not staying in my house. You've been using my money to support both households. Did I miss anything?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. "Long enough to verify everything. Long enough to document everything. Long enough to realize that the man I married doesn't actually exist. I can explain." David. The use of his name felt foreign now, like speaking a word in a language I'd forgotten. "The only explanation I need is from your lawyer. Mine will be in touch." I hung up and turned off my phone. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of activity. My blog post had been shared thousands of times, picked up by major news outlets, and turned into a cautionary tale about modern marriage and deception. Reporters called, strangers sent messages of support, and women began sharing their own stories of betrayal in the comments section. But the most important message came from Sarah Chen herself. She appeared at my door on Wednesday evening, holding a manila envelope similar to the one that had started this whole revelation. She was smaller than I'd expected from the photographs, with tired eyes and the kind of composed exhaustion that comes from working in a profession where other people's crises are your daily routine. "I saw your post," she said simply. "May I come in?" We sat in my living room, the room where I'd entertained David's colleagues, where we'd opened Christmas presents, where I'd grieved each failed pregnancy, and Sarah told me her story. She'd believed David was divorced. He'd shown her papers, told her about his ex-wife who'd been controlling and vindictive, who'd made his life miserable before he'd finally escaped. He'd explained his reluctance to discuss the marriage as trauma, his need for weekend business trips as building his consulting practice after losing everything in the divorce settlement. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice hollow. "I'm trained to spot when people are lying about their symptoms, their pain, their compliance with treatment. But I never suspected him. Not once." She'd only learned the truth when her son's school had asked for David's emergency contact information and discovered there was no record of a David Morrison at any of the addresses or phone numbers they'd been given. A parent at the school had seen my blog post and recognized Tyler from the photos I'd published. "The envelope," she said, gesturing to what she'd brought, "contains copies of everything I have. Bank statements, the lease on our apartment that's only in my name, credit applications where he listed your house as his primary residence while listing our apartment as his business address. I thought you might need them for your attorney." We sat in silence for a long moment, two women who'd been unknowingly sharing a man who'd made himself small enough to fit into both our lives by never fully inhabiting either. "I'm sorry," she said, finally. "I know that doesn't help, but I need you to know that I never would have if I'd known." "I know," I told her, and I meant it. "We were both lied to. The only difference is that his lies to you made you believe you were free to love him. His lies to me trapped me in a prison I didn't even know existed." Sarah asked about my plans, and I found myself articulating things I hadn't fully realized I'd decided. I would divorce David, obviously, but more than that, I would rebuild, not just my life, but my understanding of what my life could be. I would travel to places David had never shown interest in visiting. I would design the houses I'd always wanted to create instead of the commercially viable projects he'd pushed me toward. I would learn to cook for one, sleep in the center of the bed, and make decisions without consulting someone whose input had always been tainted by divided loyalties. "What about Tyler?" I asked. "He's going to need stability." Sarah's composure finally cracked. "He keeps asking when David is coming home. How do I explain that the man he calls dad has another family he loves more?" I didn't have an answer for that, but I made her a promise that surprised us both. "You have my number now. If you need anything, legal advice, someone to talk to, help with childcare while you sort this out, call me." We didn't choose to be connected, but we are now. We might as well help each other. The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. David's attorney tried to argue for property division and spousal support, but the documentation I'd gathered made their position untenable. A man who'd committed bigamy while using his legal wife's income to support his other family had little ground to stand on in court. More importantly, the investigation had revealed that David's consulting business was largely fictional. He'd been living off my income and Sarah's for years, supplementing with credit cards and loans that were now in default. The business trips had been David's way of maintaining the illusion of employment while actually spending time with his other family. The house remained mine, the debts remained his, and the revelation that I'd been financially supporting his double life for over a decade was strangely liberating. I'd been successful enough to carry two households, now I would be wealthy enough to build one life exactly as I wanted it. 6 months after the marriage certificate arrived in my mailbox, I stood in my kitchen again, but everything had changed. The granite countertops were the same. The coffee maker still gurgled its morning song, but the woman making coffee was fundamentally different. I'd cut my hair short, a practical decision that had become symbolic. I'd redecorated the house, removing every trace of David's presence and replacing his preferences with my own. The guest room had become my home office, where I worked on projects that excited me rather than simply paid well. I'd started accepting commissions for smaller, more innovative homes, structures that prioritize sustainability and beauty over square footage and resale value. The blog post that had changed everything continued to resonate months later. I received messages regularly from women who'd found the courage to investigate their own suspicions, from men who'd been inspired to be more honest in their relationships,
from people who'd simply needed to know they weren't alone in their betrayal and recovery. I'd started speaking at conferences about trust and transparency, drawing parallels between solid foundations in architecture and in relationships. The response was overwhelming. Apparently, there were many people living in structures they'd discovered weren't as solid as they'd believed. Sarah and I had developed an unlikely friendship. We met for coffee every few weeks, two women bonded by the shared experience of loving someone who hadn't existed. Tyler had adjusted better than expected. Children, it turned out, were remarkably resilient when the adults in their lives were honest with them. Sarah had told him that David had made choices that meant he couldn't be part of their family anymore, and while Tyler was sad, he seemed to understand that some things were final. The legal consequences for David had been more severe than I'd anticipated. Bigamy charges had been filed, though his lawyer was negotiating a plea deal. More significantly, several of his supposed business clients had come forward to report that he'd never actually performed the consulting work they'd paid for. David's double life had apparently extended beyond marriage into professional fraud. But it was the social consequences that seemed to affect him most. The blog post had made him notorious in our professional and social circles. His name had become synonymous with deception and betrayal, a cautionary tale shared in coffee shops and book clubs throughout the city. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but I felt no regret either. I'd simply told the truth, documented with the same precision I brought to architectural plans. If the truth had consequences, those consequences belonged to the person who'd made the choices that created them. On a rainy Thursday morning in November, almost exactly a year after that first marriage certificate had arrived, I received an email that made me pause in my morning routine. It was from a journalist writing a follow up story about the aftermath of viral social media revelations. She wanted to know how I was doing, whether I regretted the public nature of my response, what advice I had for others facing similar betrayals. I closed my laptop without responding immediately and walked through my house, my sanctuary, my carefully constructed life built on a foundation of truth rather than lies. In the years since David's deception had been revealed, I'd learned things about myself that I never could have discovered while living in the shadow of his elaborate fiction. I was braver than I'd known. I was more independent than I'd realized. I was capable of surviving the complete destruction of everything I'd thought I wanted, and building something better from the ruins. That evening, I finally replied to the journalist's email. You ask if I regret the public nature of my response to discovering my husband's bigamy. The question assumes that I had a choice between public and private responses, but that's not accurate. The moment David chose to live a double life, he made my private pain public by involving strangers. Sarah, Tyler, his fictitious business clients, everyone who'd been unknowingly participating in his deception. I simply chose to control the narrative rather than let his lies continue to control my life. I chose to build something true on the ruins of something false. I chose to use my voice rather than suffer in silence. The advice I have for others facing betrayal is this: you are not responsible for the lies others tell, but you are responsible for how you respond once you know the truth. You can choose to rebuild carefully, with better materials and a stronger foundation. You can choose to architect a life that belongs entirely to you. The foundation of my life crumbled when I learned the truth about my marriage. But I'm an architect. Building from solid ground is what I do best. I sent the email and turned off my computer. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the setting sun was painting my kitchen walls gold. I made myself dinner, something David had never liked, but I'd always loved, and ate slowly, savoring both the food and the silence. In the months that followed, I would travel to places I'd only dreamed of visiting. I would design houses that pushed the boundaries of sustainable architecture. I would form friendships based on genuine compatibility rather than shared secrets. I would date again eventually, but only after learning to be fully content with my own company. But that evening, I simply sat in my kitchen and appreciated the solid ground beneath my feet. I'd survived the collapse of everything I thought I wanted, and discovered that what I'd built from the ruins was stronger, more beautiful, and entirely my own. The truth I'd learned was not just powerful, it was foundational, and I was very good at building on solid foundations.